Welcome everyone, Peg Brady from NOAA Fisheries. I want to do a special thank you to Katie Posner, who has been instrumental in organizing this with me for the last number of years. And I want to also welcome Shannon, who is a new member to the NOAA library staff and is helping coordinate these important meetings. So I really, really appreciate all the support from the library. We've been holding these series since the November of 2017 to increase awareness regarding ecosystem-based management, specifically ecosystem-based fisheries management, and to highlight the progress that NOAA and its partners have been making to implement EBM and to better understand marine ecosystems. As I mentioned, the library continues to be our co-host for the series. The seminars are held on the second Wednesday of each month, and apologies for last month. We had a scheduling conflict and our speaker could not join us. And Dr. Howell will be speaking later on in the year, and we'll share the schedule later on. But each month from 3 to 4 Eastern Time, each presentation is publicly accessible, as Shannon had pointed out, recorded and archived on YouTube. And you can also see the past videos for the last couple of years there. Following today's presentation, there'll be an opportunity to ask Carissa questions, and so we'll hold the questions to the end. And Shannon will be fielding those questions to Carissa. So if we have any detailed questions, please, we'll accept them. We may take them offline, or you can speak with Carissa after the presentation. Many thanks to our speakers and to all those attendees who join us each month. And just before I turn this over to Carissa, I'd like to point out that our next speaker is Willem Claybour, who will be speaking about our Marine Ecosystems portal, information portal, on March 8th. And so please join us then at the same time. So Carissa joins us from Florida. She is a postdoctoral associate at the University of Miami and also an affiliate with our Southeast Fisheries Science Center. And as part of an integrated ecosystem assessment team, Carissa works closely with stakeholders and uses socio-ecological methods to improve fisheries stock assessments and better inform EBFM. So she earned her PhD in Natural Resource Management in 2022 from Florida International University. So welcome, Carissa. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, thank you so much, Peg and Shannon. Let me pull up my screen here and make sure you can see it. All right. Okay, are you seeing my presentation?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to give an overview of an ongoing project we have at the Southeast Fisheries Science Center, where we're using participatory modeling of red snapper populations in the Gulf of Mexico to support ecosystem considerations in the stock assessment and management process. So over the past century, anthropogenic pressure on marine ecosystems has expanded dramatically. Everything from increasing fishing pressure to global warming, habitat loss and modification, and pollution are all interacting with the natural resources that we depend on. Currently, rates of ecosystem change are at record highs, which is prompting a pressing need for rapid and adaptive ocean management that considers a myriad of interacting factors. And scientists have known of this need for many years now. It's the whole reason we're here for this seminar series on EBFM. The concept of ecosystem-based management is not new, but it remains incredibly challenging to implement. Many fish stocks in the US continue to be assessed and managed with these traditional fishery management plans that account for the dynamics of a single fishery in isolation from a lot of the ecosystem factors that undoubtedly interact with it. And when we're missing key drivers and linkages in the system, it can lead to a lot of uncertainty about stock status, but can also cause a lot of social and economic issues. This is because fisheries are socio-ecological systems. Human activities and well-being are integral components. This is recognized by NOAA's IEA program, which is intended to be sort of the analytical engine with which to accomplish EBFM, similar to how stock assessments are the tool for accomplishing single species management. The Gulf of Mexico IEA was developed back in 2010, and it has an agreed upon conceptual model and mission statement that guides all of its work. Note here that human activities are purposefully appearing in the center of the model, and there's a mention in the mission statement about balancing the needs of both humans and the ecosystem. So this emphasizes that EBFM includes not only the non-managed biological components of a system, but also human components. So this framework is great, right? If we can take into account all of the ecosystem factors that are influencing our fisheries, we can decrease uncertainty and better manage our important fish stocks. But in reality, this is really hard to do, right? We can't take into account everything. We don't have the funding or the manpower or time to research all of these factors. And the truth is, a lot of these factors may only have minor effects and don't need to be considered in a management context. So the question then becomes, how do we determine which ecosystem factors are important, and where do we need to prioritize research that assesses how these factors interact with our fisheries? This is where partnerships with fisheries stakeholders can be extremely beneficial. Stakeholders are local fishermen, fish dealers, anyone with many years of experience using a fishery resource. And studies have shown that fishermen have a wealth of knowledge about the environments in which they fish, and that this knowledge can both complement existing biological data and provide us with new insights. This has been variously called local fisher or traditional ecological knowledge. Okay, so we know that stakeholders have this wealth of information about the natural environment in their brains, but how do we access that information and translate it into something that can be used in the stock assessment and management context? Well, we can use this tool called Participatory System Dynamics Modeling, which is a method commonly used to increase our understanding of complex systems. The way that it works is via conversations and workshops with stakeholders, conceptual models of a system are created. And here's just some examples on the right here of a stakeholder workshop where such a conceptual model was put together. And in the bottom right here, you can see this board with a bunch of sticky notes and lines drawn on it, where all the sticky notes are drivers that stakeholders identified as important drivers in the system. And then all the lines drawn between them are the linkages and feedback loops among those drivers. So we can identify a lot of the complexity that exists in these systems through these participatory modeling workshops. So the purpose of this research was to use participatory modeling to understand the ecosystem drivers of Gulf of Mexico red snapper populations. First off, why the focus on red snapper? Well, first of all, red snapper is one of the most prized fish in the Gulf of Mexico, and it was the most landed finfish species in 2018. The recreational fishery for red snapper is particularly substantial, accounting for 80% of the total landings in that year, despite a small 2 fish per person per day bag limit. Research has also suggested that managing recreational fisheries using the concepts of optimum yield may be a better approach than managing for MSY, as OY takes into account ecological, economic, and social goals. A recent National Academy of Sciences review actually recommended that NOAA fisheries and the councils should develop a process for engaging recreational fisheries stakeholders in a more in-depth discussion of optimum yield and how it can be used to identify and prioritize management objectives that are better suited to the cultural, economic, and conservation goals of the angling community. However, we still lack a complete understanding of what optimum yield means for fisheries like red snapper and how exactly to manage for it. In addition to being one of the most popular fish in the Gulf, the red snapper fishery also has a very contentious history. The fishery collapsed in the 1980s due to severe overfishing, and it's been undergoing a substantial rebuilding plan ever since. There have also been efforts to increase the population and fishing opportunities with an unparalleled expansion of artificial reefs, particularly in the Central Gulf. The potential effects of this highly engineered system are as yet unknown. Strict regulations and allocations over the years has led to a lot of conflict in the fishery, and this conflict in large part led to the Great Red Snapper Count, a $12 million effort to estimate absolute abundance of red snapper in the Gulf. This effort identified a surprisingly substantial biomass in these offshore, uncharacterized bottom habitats. These results, unsurprisingly, have led to some further contention in the fishery. Gulf of Mexico red snapper are of particular interest right now because the fishery is currently undergoing a research track assessment, which is basically an extended stock assessment process where extensive changes in data, models, or stock structures can be considered. So there's a lot of flexibility in the research track process for new information to be considered and incorporated. Furthermore, the current assessment terms of reference, or TORs, include describing any known evidence regarding ecosystem factors that may affect red snapper population dynamics. Now, this TOR is actually included in the TORs for a lot of stock assessments for several different species, but it's something that has historically been really difficult to address. Typically in the past, it's been addressed mainly through a literature search, but that doesn't necessarily get at all of the current ecosystem issues that are impacting the fishery. So the point of this presentation is to show how participatory modeling can really help to address this TOR. Okay, so as I mentioned briefly earlier, the participatory modeling process typically consists of holding in-person workshops with stakeholders where we use sticky notes and markers and everything to draw out these conceptual models of the fishery system. However, because of travel restrictions due to the COVID pandemic, we couldn't do a lot of these in-person workshops that we would typically conduct. So we had to switch up our methodology a little bit. And we actually began with phone conversations with individual stakeholders. And these were very informal, semi-structured conversations where we really allowed the stakeholders to guide the conversation and let us know what they thought was important in the red snapper system. We then used those conversations to create draft conceptual models. And those models are now being validated using in-person workshops. So fortunately, now that travel restrictions are starting to lift, we were able to thus far have one model validation workshop where we met with stakeholders in person. We showed them the draft models that we created and made sure that we included all the important components and didn't misinterpret anything that stakeholders mentioned to us. So this is still ongoing. We're hoping to conduct a few more of these validation workshops over the next several months. And that's really where the participatory part of this process comes into play. So once we have all of those models validated, our next step is to identify the main drivers and linkages in the system, link those drivers to the stock assessment process, and then compile existing data and identify any future research needs. Okay, so jumping into our results to date, we've so far put together 3 regional conceptual models of the red snapper fishery in the Gulf of Mexico. And those are the East model, which comprises the Central Florida region, The central model is Alabama, Mississippi, and the Florida Panhandle, and the west model is Louisiana and Texas. And the reason we split out the conceptual models in this way is that they roughly align with the current stock assessment boundaries that you can see here in the yellow lines on the map. And so far, we've had 50 total stakeholder participants in this project. And this table here just shows a breakdown of the fleets and regions that these stakeholder participants are from. As you can see, we focus most of our effort on this central region, and that's because that is where the majority of red snapper landings and effort are concentrated. You can see here on this map, this is estimated recreational landings, and that central region is really where the bulk of landings are from. So we wanted to make sure we had a really good handle on what stakeholders thought about red snapper in that region. Okay, so this is a really busy slide. I don't expect you to be able to read much of this, but I wanted to just throw this up as an example of what these models actually look like. So this is our central model where we identified 78 nodes or drivers in the system and 117 linkages between those nodes. So as you can see, we were able to identify a lot of complexity in the system from our conversations with stakeholders. Okay, so now that we have our conceptual models of the red snapper system, the next step is to pull from these models hypotheses about the important ecosystem factors that are related to stock assessment and management. Going back to this IEA diagram, again, we're trying to pick out from a whole range of ecosystem factors those factors that may be having the greatest impact on the red snapper fishery. To accomplish this, we are following the recommendations of the Socioeconomic Aspects in Stock Assessments Workshop, or Seesaw Report. Seesaw was born out of an understanding at the federal level that there's a need to better integrate quantitative and qualitative socioeconomic data into fisheries management to generate hypotheses and discern and test policy impacts. The report was published in June of last year, and it provides recommendations for increasing assessment accuracy and improving management advice by better incorporating socioeconomic data into the stock assessment process. So in the report, the authors break down the stock assessment process into these 6 steps shown here in the table on the left, and they suggest how socioeconomic data can be incorporated into each step. So for the next few slides, I'll show how our participatory modeling efforts provide both quantitative and qualitative ecosystem information that can inform each step of this process. Okay, so the data collection step of the stock assessment process includes fisheries independent data from surveys, abiotic and other relevant environmental data, and fisheries dependent data on catch and effort trends. Now, while we have long time series of fisheries dependent data, for example here, recreational landings and discards, these numbers don't give us a complete picture of changes in the fishery landscape over time. For example, stakeholders have observed that recreational effort has increased substantially, and that fishing technology has made it easier for novice anglers to target and catch red snapper even in offshore areas. These quotes from charter captains highlight some of the impacts of this increased effort, including localized depletion that forces anglers to move further and further offshore to target red snapper. This captain on the bottom here stated that electronics have made everybody a fisherman, allowing recreational anglers to target fish in previously unknown or inaccessible areas. So this leads to the question, where are these landings from? And are fishermen changing where and how they target red snapper? If they are, more data on the spatial distribution of fishing effort may need to be collected. Another important thing to consider with fisheries-dependent data is the fate of discarded fish, especially for fisheries like red snapper that are predominantly catch and release. You can see here that discards in the red snapper fishery are much greater than the landings here. Now, numerous stakeholders expressed concerns about increasing depredation, which is where fish are removed from fishing hooks by non-target species like sharks and dolphins. This potential source of increased mortality is currently not being incorporated in the red snapper stock assessment. So the impacts of these discards on the red snapper population may be underestimated. As you can see from this quote here, this charter captain mentioned that there's a huge depredation issue that can increase bycatch mortality rates from about 20% on average to anywhere up to 100%. Now, the next step of the stock assessment process is the data processing phase. And this includes things like calculating abundance indices from catch per unit effort data. When calculating abundance indices, it's important to account for factors besides fish abundance that may influence catch rates. As you can see in this sort of example graph here on the right, the nominal CPUE trend or average CPUE trend can differ from a standardized CPUE trend because of other factors that could be influencing abundance. So when calculating abundance indices, it's important to account for these factors that may influence catch rates. However, these factors can be difficult to identify without detailed knowledge of fishery operations and fish behavior. Anglers identified several factors that can influence catchability of red snapper and thus impact the accuracy of CPUE data as an index of fish abundance. The first factor that they identified was hurricanes, and this was mainly an issue in the central Gulf region where hurricanes are unfortunately fairly common. And hurricanes can move or shift small artificial reef structures where red snapper are typically targeted. And they can also move fish closer inshore or further away from shore, either increasing or decreasing catchability. Another thing stakeholders mentioned was an increase in fishing technology over time. Boats are faster and more reliable, and technology such as fish finders and trolling motors with spot locks have allowed even the most novice angler to easily target and catch red snapper. So this has increased catchability of the species over time. And finally, stakeholders mentioned that localized depletion is a common issue. The red snapper fishing season in most areas is about 2 or 3 months over the summer. And most stakeholders mentioned that at the beginning of this red snapper season, the fish are pretty easy to catch and pretty easy to locate even in nearshore environments. But as the season progresses, those fish in nearshore environments tend to get fished out, and anglers have to move further and further offshore to locate and target red snapper. So that's a decrease in catchability within the course of the fishing season. Including these factors in CPUE standardization models could therefore help us improve the accuracy of abundance indices derived from fisheries-dependent data. The next step of the stock assessment process is creating stock assessment models. Now, different types of models are used to support stock status determinations depending on data availability and characteristics of the fishery. Participatory modeling can aid in both selecting an appropriate stock assessment method for the fishery of interest and also improving model fit. One particular way that participatory modeling results can improve model fit is by informing time blocks for when the fishery has changed in some substantial way. So the red snapper stock assessment model is a stock synthesis model, which is an age-structured population dynamics model, and it can incorporate time blocks for time-varying parameters. For example, here in the current model, there are time blocks in place for changes in selectivity and in retention based on the minimum size for the commercial handline fishery. In our study, red snapper anglers have noticed a dramatic increase in depredation rates and thus discard mortality in recent years. From the phone conversations we had with stakeholders, we were able to piece together timelines of both shark depredation and dolphin depredation and how they've changed over time. These timelines could be used in the red snapper stock synthesis model to set various discard mortality rates for certain time periods. Now, the next step of the process is model projections. Due to the complex nature of stock assessments, they're typically only updated every 3 years or so, depending on the fishery. Management decisions, however, often have to be made much more frequently, meaning that assessment results can be several years outdated by the time these decisions are being made. Model projections are used to calculate stock status and management reference points forward in time to fill this gap. But when projections are run, all the stock and fishery dynamics that are shown here on the right for red snapper are based on recent averages or the terminal year of data. But these dynamics could feasibly change very rapidly over a few years. Participatory modeling allows us to acquire information about changing fishery dynamics in real time from stakeholders who are constantly on the water, therefore potentially helping to bridge this gap between assessment results and the current state of the fishery. A great example here is the observation that fishing technology has allowed recreational anglers to target red snapper in previously inaccessible locations, mainly deep waters offshore. This quote from a Florida charter captain suggests that increasing vessel and engine size has increased targeting of larger fish in deeper waters. And if we look at outboard engine sales trends from the National Marine Manufacturers Association, we do in fact see a substantial increase in sales of boats with 300 plus horsepower engines. So this leads us to a hypothesis that the recreational fleet in the future may be harvesting larger, older fish than they are currently, which stock assessment scientists could consider when running model projections. And the last step of the stock assessment process from the Seesaw Report is communication with managers and stakeholders. Another issue that stakeholders identified in our models was illegal recreational harvest of red snapper. In this quote from a commercial captain, he notes that enforcement is particularly weak outside the red snapper season, and he regularly hears of people who harvest above the bag limit and outside the fishing season. And this article here I thought was interesting. It describes federal seizure of illegally caught red snapper in Texas waters that seems to validate at least some of these stakeholder concerns. By engaging stakeholders in the management process via participatory modeling methods, we can hopefully create more buy-in to management and better compliance, which is a great thing in and of itself. Furthermore, the participatory process can help to identify indicators that are more reactive to current stock or fishery conditions. For example, the commercial red snapper fishery is currently under an IFQ system, which means that commercial fishermen need to purchase or lease shares in order to harvest red snapper. Several stakeholders we spoke to noted that there is a correlation between the abundance of red snapper and lease prices. So managers may be able to analyze economic lease price data to get a better sense of abundance trends during the intervening years between stock assessment updates. Finally, participatory modeling can help us to communicate the unintended consequences of any given management action. For example, the collapse of red snapper in the 1980s led to strict management action that included decreasing bag limits and shortening the length of the recreational snapper season. Now, while these actions have undoubtedly helped to rebuild the fishery, there were some unintended consequences. Stakeholders noted that the small bag limits and short seasons have led to a substantial increase in high grading and discarding in the recreational fishery. High grading is where anglers will throw back smaller fish that they catch so that they can retain the largest fish possible, since the bag limit is so small. And if the season is too short, by default, any fish that are captured outside of the open season have to be discarded. So this increase in high grading and discarding has led to an observed increase in depredation and scavenging by predators. This has been exacerbated by a perceived increase in shark abundance throughout the Gulf of Mexico, mainly due to a decrease in shark longlining. And another interesting thing that anglers noticed is that dolphin are learning over generations to follow fishing boats because of all the discards. They see all the discards and just hear the dinner bell ringing. So they know that following those boats is a good idea. And so all of this has led to an increase in depredation or scavenging, which stakeholders believe may be increasing post-release mortality rates, and therefore could have an impact on red snapper local abundance, which again is sort of counteractive to the original intention of these management actions. These types of downstream human behavior changes in response to management actions are things that we normally wouldn't know about without talking to stakeholders, and things that managers will find of interest and need to take into consideration when creating new management actions. Okay, so to recap a bit, we created participatory models of the red snapper fishery, and we used them to identify important factors that may be influencing red snapper population dynamics. Then we walked through each step of the stock assessment process and determined how these ecosystem factors could be incorporated. Now, the next step is to work with stock assessment scientists, managers, and stakeholders to identify research priorities and engage in collaborative management that will continue to rebuild the red snapper population in the Gulf while considering the needs of the many stakeholders who rely on this iconic fishery. And with that, I would like to acknowledge the many people who have assisted with this project, specifically the red snapper stock assessment team, various individuals who helped connect us with fishery stakeholders and set up workshops, and also the 50 stakeholder participants who volunteered their time to talk to us on the phone and make this project a reality. And with that, my email address is on the slide if you have any questions for me. And thank you so much for watching.
All right, so the first question we have here is, would you please repost the title of the NOAA Tech memo that is summarizing this project?
Yes, that is the Seesaw Report, which I will pull up that slide here where I mentioned that. Let's see here. Here we go.
The next question we have, it's more of just a comment, that there's no reliable depredation data. Fishermen feedback may be biased and not reflective of the dolphin depredation dates or nature of it.
That's a really great point. And depredation is something that a lot of the stakeholders we spoke to are very passionate about. They're very upset by it and they're not really sure what to do about it. But at least in their perception, it's a huge issue. So it's definitely something that we think requires additional research. And there are some ongoing projects right now that are starting to look at characterizing depredation in the Gulf of Mexico. So it's certainly something that these stakeholders, again, are passionate about, and that hopefully with some additional research, we can get a better handle on how much it's actually occurring and how much it's really impacting our fisheries.
Wonderful. And we have another comment here too. Participatory modeling should include more diverse stakeholders, including shark and dolphin expertise, so you get a holistic perspective and not a one-sided concern. Also, with rampant declines in fish populations and habitat quality, all ecosystem components, especially top predators, are severely impacted, but few studies characterize these impacts.
That's a great point, for sure. And again, so for our purposes, we have so far only spoken to stakeholders who are either commercial, recreational, or charter captains. But I definitely agree that including other stakeholders in the participatory process could definitely help improve our models. So that is certainly a step forward.
Next question we have here. Great presentation. Do you see this kind of information primarily providing qualitative input into the management and assessment processes and context for interpreting results? Or is the aim to identify quantitative inputs that can be integrated into assessments?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the answer is both. So as I mentioned, when we kind of walked through the stock assessment models step of the process, I mentioned how we could be informing time blocks in the stock assessment from various observations by stakeholders about when major things in the fishery changed over time. So I think that's an example of quantitative information that could help inform the stock assessment process. In other situations, the information might be more qualitative, especially if we really don't have any data on impacts. For example, with hurricanes and how hurricanes really impact catchability of red snapper, we don't have a lot of data on exactly how that happens, but that could be an avenue for future research if funding and time is available to do so. Otherwise, it's more of a qualitative input into the process.
Wonderful. Next question we have here. Is this process a more qualitative way of informing a better stock assessment modeling? Thank you.
Okay, great. So the participatory modeling process really aims to incorporate some of those social, economic, and ecosystem factors into the stock assessment process that are not normally incorporated, right? So by speaking to stakeholders on the ground and putting together these full conceptual models of the system, we're able to pull out a lot of complexity that exists, and that just sort of enhances the stock assessment process. Whether the information is qualitative or quantitative, I think we could sort of get a mixture of both, like I mentioned in my last response. But the goal, again, is to incorporate more of these sort of ecosystem factors that traditionally aren't taken into account.
Fantastic, thank you. Next question we have, are you also considering changes in the habitat for younger/smaller fish?
That's a good point. Habitats for younger and smaller fish, I don't know if that's really something that a lot of stakeholders mentioned. This process, again, it's very much stakeholder driven. So we allowed the stakeholders to tell us what they thought was most important in the system and what the main changes in the system are. And so that's how we sort of put together these models. So instead of us asking sort of specific questions of the stakeholders, we let them sort of drive the process so that we can get as much information from them as possible. But yeah, I think the more people that we talk to, the more stakeholders we interview, the more information we'll get them to fill in the complexity of these models.
The next question we have is, have there been attempts to analyze depredation through this PM process to make models that help fishermen examine the mechanisms and causes of depredation with scientists and managers?
Yeah, great question. So there is actually an ongoing study led by Dr. Marcus Dryman. He is working, and his team are working to characterize depredation in the Gulf of Mexico. And they have held some specific stakeholder workshops to talk about depredation, talk about how much of an issue it is, what species of sharks tend to be the issue, and some, potential remedies or ways that they can sort of get around the issue. So that is definitely something that is ongoing research, and hopefully we'll be able to figure out in a few years what exactly is going on with depredation and better characterize it in the Gulf.
All right, the next question we have is, have you compared the results of traditional modern stock assessments with stock assessments augmented by socioeconomic aspects?
That's a great question. And I think to date, there aren't a lot of stock assessments that have rigorously sort of incorporated this sort of socioeconomic information. And that's sort of what bore this, Seesaw report, right? This understanding that there is a need for increasing socioeconomic information into the stock assessment process. So we haven't yet compared stock assessments that include more socioeconomic data. I have to do some digging and see what kinds of assessments exist with that information, but I think this is an exciting avenue that hopefully more stock assessments will continue to incorporate this kind of data. And we hope that, in this presentation, I've sort of given a sense that participatory modeling can be a tool that can help us to accomplish that.
Awesome. All right, the next question we have here is, could you elaborate a little bit more on that role of artificial reefs in engineering the ecosystem? Is this something stakeholders mentioned specifically, or is this more of an observation from CPEU studies?
Yes, so artificial reefs is definitely something that stakeholders mentioned specifically. Stakeholders mentioned that is where a lot of fishing effort is concentrated, specifically for the recreational fishery, and especially in the Central Gulf region. The Central Gulf seems to be very reliant on these artificial structures as fishing habitat for red snapper. But there were also some stakeholders who thought that these structures can increase abundance of the fishery, providing good recruitment habitat, juvenile habitat for red snapper. So they were definitely mentioned as being important components of the system. And states like Alabama have put a lot of effort into putting more of these artificial structures out. So there's definitely the notion that they're very important for the fishery.
Does this participatory modeling process build buy-in to accepting the results of stock assessment?
Yeah, so we hope that that's one of the benefits, right? So by engaging stakeholders in this process, we hope that they have a better understanding of why management actions are happening and how they might benefit stakeholders. And I think when we take information that stakeholders give us and pay attention to the things that they think are important and pass that on to, managers for consideration, then that kind of shows that, we're listening to the stakeholder concerns, and that might, help to alleviate any concerns that maybe management doesn't care about what they think or doesn't want to incorporate their thoughts and opinions. So hopefully this is definitely a way that we can help increase that buy-in.
All right, the next question we have is, can you talk a bit about how LEK may be useful in harvest control rules?
That's a great question. Yes, you might have noticed I skipped over the harvest control rules step of the process. So harvest control rules are sort of ways that managers take the results of the stock assessment process and develop sort of rules for setting catch limits and things along those lines. So where this LEK process can contribute to that is something that I think we need to think a little bit more about, and it sort of depends on the fishery, right, and how exactly that fishery is managed. But potentially we could increase information such as, kind of help to, like I mentioned with projections, bridge that gap between stock assessment results and management decisions, so that if there are sort of some major changes in the fishery in the intervening years between assessment updates, that could potentially have an impact on harvest control rules and the way that the fishery is managed. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. Then last question we have here. If anyone has any questions they've been thinking about sending in, this is your last chance to do it. The last one we have in here right now is, were any socioeconomic data directly entered into the stock assessment model?
Not yet. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the red snapper stock assessment is currently ongoing. And we are working closely with the stock assessment scientists to sort of update them on our results as we go. And we do hope to have, continued conversations with their team and see where we can input some of this information into the assessment process. So that is something that is ongoing, and hopefully we'll be able to incorporate a lot of this information into the current research track assessment.
All right, and we got one more question come in. You're not off the hook yet. Great talk. Can you explain the difference between nominal versus standardized CPEU and how EBFM can inform the difference?
Sure. So nominal CPUE is basically just average CPUE, right? Your average catch per unit effort in a given year. Now, when you're trying to think about catch per unit effort as an index of abundance, there are other factors besides abundance that can influence catch rates, right? So things like the time of the year, the year itself, day, etc. Those can all impact catch rates in addition to the abundance of the species of interest. So when you're standardizing that CPUE data, you're accounting for those variables that are influencing catch. So it's sort of it kind of standardizes the CPUE trend so that it's actually an index of abundance to the best of the ability that you can. So if you can identify all of those factors that are influencing catch rates in addition to abundance, you can account for them in your standardization models and have a better index of abundance from CPUE data. So that was kind of the point I was trying to make here, that sometimes it's difficult to identify what those factors that influence catchability are. But from conversations with fishermen, we can try to identify some of those important factors.
Okay, we have one more question. I know I think that's the third time I've said that now, but it's fantastic. All of these questions have been fantastic. We love this. So last question as of right now is, what resources are required to do these surveys?
So fortunately, there's not a lot of resources that you really need to conduct these surveys. Again, like I mentioned, we sort of did a bit of a different approach because of COVID, where we just reached out to stakeholders and had phone conversations. So just by identifying the important stakeholders in the fishery and having conversations with them, and from my experience, a lot of these stakeholders are very open and willing to discussing their fisheries and the things that they care about. And so then putting together these models is simply, a computer exercise of pulling information from what stakeholders told us and sticking it into this sort of modeling framework. So yeah, that's, I think, one of the benefits of the participatory approach is that it's sort of something that can be done with relatively low cost, low effort, requires, setting up some workshops, ideally to meet with people in person and put together these models. But again, we can also get, really real-time information from stakeholders since they're on the water all the time.